So as I believe you're all aware, this is really an interfaith Zendo. As you can look at the table afterwards that Don made for us, there's the Dharma wheel, the Buddhist Dharma wheel on one side and the cross on the other. And hopefully it's a symbol of how we can merge this in our own lives. Now, whether we're Buddhist or Christian or neither, I often make the point, and we can discuss it if you want, that every civilized person in today's world needs to know the basic truths, the basic articulations of the major world religions. So if you're Buddhist, you should know about Christianity. Not just because you might be in this country for a while, but for that reason, because we do need to be global citizens and hopefully profit from the insights we can get from the other tradition, the same thing Christians and Buddhists, to know, and perhaps even as you're doing, practicing and assimilating the truths. So as many of you know, around Christmas time I spoke about the birth of Siddhartha and Jesus and compared them, and a few weeks ago we compared the temptations of Jesus in the desert and Siddhartha just before his enlightenment. Today I'd like, as we approach Passion Week and Easter and the Wesak festival also in Buddhism shortly, talk a bit about suffering and maybe a little bit about death, but death and resurrection will especially put off for a couple more weeks until after Easter. But to talk about the approach to suffering in both traditions and compare. And if we're going to know about any religion, but especially if we're to know about Christianity and Buddhism, it's good to know accurately. Many Christians don't know their tradition all that well, and I suspect it could be true for Buddhists as well. And so, especially when we look at other traditions, we're bound to get easily false impressions or glib approaches, which certainly has been the case in the past when Christianity looked at Buddhism, for example. So, for example, this is a gross oversimplification and therefore probably true in many cases in people's minds. Christianity is about suffering and wanting to suffer and suffer with Jesus, and Jesus had to suffer in order to placate his Father and suffer for us, So we want to suffer in Christianity. Whereas in Buddhism, supposedly, we flee suffering and we get away from suffering and we escape suffering. That's what it's for. So in Christianity, you're supposed to suffer. In Buddhism, you're not supposed to suffer. Well, I hope you realize that neither of those is true. And let's look at it a little bit. First of all, I'm giving a series of lectures now on a new book by Elizabeth Johnson on creation and the cross to get rid of especially the penal substitution theory that has plagued and brainwashed Christians for generations, centuries, whereby Jesus was punished for our sins vicariously, and therefore we got off free because he suffered for us to placate his angry Father. Don't laugh, and I hope you're not laughing, because that's what has really twisted and deformed a lot of Christian imaginations over the years. So we need to look at a new way of that, of why Jesus suffered and how and what it meant. And then I was looking at the Buddhism as well. Now I thought I'd start by actually quoting from towards the end of a new book by Richard Rohr on the universal Christ. How a forgotten reality can change everything we see, hope for, and believe. And towards the end, he speaks about, in a chapter about transformation and contemplation, meditation, what we're doing as being the key to going deeper in all traditions and meeting other traditions. The subtitle, Why So Much Talk of Suffering and Dying? Well, it's a good question. The cross is a central symbol. Jesus talked a lot about losing your life. He speaks about Ken Wilber's distinction between climbing religions and descending religions. And if we go deep into any religion, Christianity or Buddhism, it goes down. It goes down deep into ourselves, down into the depths of reality, and it can be dark and painful there. So how does that work? So it's not about acquiring, ascending, getting health, wealth, success in this world. Of course, that's not real religion at all. So then he says, now it's interesting when Cynthia Bourgeault or Richard Rohr or even Thomas Merton speak about Buddhism. They have wonderful insights, but they need tweaking because none of them actually has Buddhist training. So anyway, Buddhists talk a lot about suffering and dying, making it its own kind of descending religion. He says even more directly than Jesus did. Life is suffering is one of the Four Noble Truths. It's the first noble truth. Okay, but what do we mean by that? What kind of suffering are we talking about? Okay. In the Buddhist frame, suffering is not a requirement for following Jesus, not a way to gain merit for eternity, not the proverbial carrying of the cross towards salvation, not no pain, no gain. But I would emphasize it's not any of that in Christianity either, if you know what you're talking about, or understanding the phrase, what does carrying the cross actually mean? We'll get to that. Instead, he says, suffering is seen as the practical and real price for letting go of illusion, false desire, superiority, and separateness. The prime illusion, I think, is separateness. So that's very true. There's a certain suffering involved in any tradition, certainly in Christianity and in Buddhism, and how long you're going to sit on your cushion before you realize that. That suffering is the practical and real price for letting go. In fact, you can even say, as Roshi Ellen Burks says in her chapter on suffering called Letting Go, which I'll quote in a minute, suffering is letting go, and the ego hates that. The ego wants to be in control. And of course, it winds up causing even more suffering by trying to be in control when it can't. That's where a lot of the suffering comes from as well. Not letting go. But there's suffering in letting go insofar as the ego has to die, and it's going to be more or less kicking and screaming until we get used to the process of dying. And Zen talks a lot about this kind of death, as well as so does Christianity. So there is that mystical death, that ego death that has to take place in both. And that can, depending on our resistance, cause suffering. And that's what he goes on to say here in the last sentence. Suffering is also pointed out as the price we pay for not letting go, which might be an even better way to teach about suffering, he suggests. Yes. So that is what Buddhism means primarily about suffering. It's that clinging, it's that holding on, it's that resistance that the ego puts up, and that's also true in Christianity. So he continues, anytime you surrender a negative, accusatory, compulsive, or self-serving thought, word, or behavior, the Buddhists describe this as dying. Well, so do the Christians. So that's a dying, when you surrender that kind of thinking and reacting and feeling. Power, self-image, and control, all that ego stuff, do not give up without a fight. And this is first of all true inside our own minds and our hearts, where the illusions begin. Okay. So the grain of wheat has to fall into the earth and die, dying before you die, which he often says. That's what we're talking about here. Or as the Buddhists call it, the Zen talk, great death, dying the great death, as Joshu says, dying that death to ourselves. So suffering and death are inevitable, at least in those senses that it's suffering when you don't let go, and then it's suffering when you do learn to let go, because that's also painful. So you're not going to escape that the measure in which there's resistance. So that kind of carrying the cross of ourselves and our resistance, that's true. You can call it that in any tradition. He says, the real goal is to choose skillful and necessary suffering, in this kind of practice, over what is usually just resented and projected suffering, that resistance. In that, Richard says, in that the Buddha was a spiritual genius, and we Christians can learn a lot from him and his true followers. For Christians, of course, he says, the goal is divine love and not the overcoming of suffering. well, okay, we don't talk about divine love as such in Buddhism, but there is coming to reality, to what the reality of the universe is, and that is love and compassion. So that's our true self that we come to in any tradition. And you can describe it as you wish, personally or not. And it's not the overcoming of suffering. Well, you don't want to say either that that's just the only goal of Buddhism is to overcome suffering. There is a positive element too, which is also compassion and love. So it's really important. That's why I say it's not just about fleeing from suffering, but being compassionate. And that's his last sentence here. Yet look how many Buddhists become highly compassionate human beings. So yes, it's not just about the avoidance of suffering. It's about compassion. Both groups are saying that death and life are two sides of the same coin, and you cannot have one without the other. Each time you offer the surrender, each time you trust the dying, you're led to a deeper level and you discover a larger self underneath. Call it the Christ self, call it the Buddha nature, but you discover that larger reality there. Let go of your narcissistic anger, you find you start feeling much happier. You surrender your need to control your partner, and finally the relationship blossoms. Underline that. Yet each time it is a choice, and each time it is a kind of dying. All right? And we'll come back to the very end of the pattern. So what Ellen Burks, as you know, Roshi Kennedy's first successor, she's a nurse, and she's written a number of books. This one is called Healing Zen, and her chapter on suffering, as I said, is called Letting Go. And she says at the very beginning the 6 types of suffering that the Buddhists speak about. I'm not quite sure where she got this, but it's quite an accurate enumeration. The trauma of birth and disease, so birth, sickness, what the Buddha himself discovered when he went out into the world finally and saw what it was really like. The losses that come with old age and death, which the Buddha also discovered. Being tied to what you dislike and being separated from what you love. So that's enumerated in the first noble truth in its full presentation, that suffering, that life is, it comes from our clinging. Not wanting to have what's there, or wanting to have what's not, separated from what we do want and not being tied to what you dislike. All that is an ego reaction. You can't resist what comes. There has to be a basic acceptance of what is. Eckhart Tolle speaks about this a lot as well. We cause. So as the Buddha taught that the cause of suffering is selfish craving, and the end of suffering is found in letting go of selfish craving. So it's the resistance to reality. However you go on to deal with reality, it has to start with a basic acceptance, or you'll never have peace of heart in this world. You cause your own, you increase the suffering. Yeah? So the Buddha does not say that suffering is unavoidable. You put it this way: pain is unavoidable, suffering is optional, as they say. So it's it depends how you define suffering. Sickness, old age, and death, birth, and all of that is unavoidable. Even Buddhists don't try and get away from it. They just don't resist it. And so they don't add to the suffering of life by their own suffering. And actually, if you accept it, you find a peace there. And a deeper self, a deeper connection to reality when you stop resisting it and trying to control it with your ego. That suffering vanishes. And if you call that suffering, well, then we are free of suffering in any tradition. She tells the story of Suzuki Roshi, Suzuki, who was dying of cancer. If when I die, the moment I'm dying, if I suffer, that's okay, he says. That's the suffering Buddha. That's just reality. Sickness, old age, and death. Don't resist. So should not or would not, that doesn't enter into it. And also he tells the story of Bodhidharma and his disciple. Remember when he's standing out in the snow and he wants Bodhidharma for his master, and he cuts off his arm standing in a waist-deep snow. Not literally to be taken, as she says, but it shows that you have to be willing to suffer, to go through a lot of pain to get to this kind of freedom. So that's carrying your cross, if you want to call it that. That's the kind of suffering is inevitable, but it's life-giving. Yeah. So you let go of your expectations, controlling, fixed opinions, she says, letting go of your separate self, as we just saw in Richard. The process of letting go can be difficult. At times it can feel like death, but it does not result in death in any ultimate sense. On the contrary. So when you do stop resisting and discover the basic energy of the universe, which is flowing, which is love and compassion, that true self, that's what you go out towards then. That's who you are. And that's what you connect with. So that's how Christ works. Call it solidarity with suffering. So he didn't need to placate an angry God. That's nonsense. But what Christ did is not flee suffering, but embracing the suffering of the world. Solidarity and compassion. Solidarity with the suffering of the world, or the sin of the world, or whatever you want to call it. And suffering it himself. The unjust execution, the establishment, political and religious, that killed him. And death is part of being human as well, as we just said. So you're not going to resist that. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. So the solidarity and acceptance of people as they are, and taking on in the universal compassion, that's what saves the world, if you like. But that's what we do with and in Christ, with and in the Buddha. He has a good presentation here. The cruciform reality has a cruciform pattern. There's always going to be opposites colliding, as he says. Conflicting interests, half-truths, empire, religion. Cross was the price Jesus paid for living in a mixed world, which is both human and divine, utterly broken and utterly whole. He hung between a good thief and a bad thief, between heaven and earth, inside humanity and divinity, absolute and relative, you can say, for all of this. Utterly whole and yet utterly disfigured. The further down you go, the more broken you are, but the more whole you are, because it's compassion and love. And you don't flee from that. Recapitulating everything in himself. So much so that this is something the Buddhists say as well, and I'm glad to see Christians are saying it now. There's one death and one suffering. Everything dies, and we're one with that death, and we're dying continually anyway. And there's one suffering, the suffering of the world. So when we say Jesus died for the suffering of all, he suffered for all people, of course he did. Who else would it be? What else would it be? It's connection to the whole suffering, to the whole of reality, the whole of compassion. But so does the Buddha, so do Buddhists, so do Christians. So should they, anyway, connect with that. There's one suffering that you connect with. There's solidarity in suffering, and there's universal compassion. One suffering, one death, and one love in it. That's the universal quality, whether Christ or the Buddha. I love the image of the in the Blue Cliff Record in the koan about the Bodhisattva of compassion that I've often quoted, where it has 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes, because it's reaching everywhere and seeing everywhere. The name itself means hearing all the sounds of the world, the crying out of the world. This is the Sacred Heart, Jesus and Mary. This is the Buddhist Bodhisattva of compassion. This is what it means to be suffering on that level and to be fully alive on that level. And the koan goes on to say, well, that's only 80% of it, 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes. There are eyes within, not just on the outside. You see the statues that have depicted on the outside, but even the inside is full of eyes and ears and arms. Our whole being is that. Our whole being is that compassion. That's what we mean by the Christ or the Buddha. And it's a universal truth. So I like the way Richard ends the chapter, where he says, the way things work and Christ are one and the same. Or the way things work and Buddha are one and the same. Reality itself is this. And it's just the way things are. Cruciform pattern of reality, and embracing it and not resisting it, and opening your heart to the compassion, the fundamental energy of the universe, by whatever title. This is not a religion, he says, to be either fervently joined or angrily rejected. It just is the way things are. It's a train ride already in motion. Just get on you're on the train. You're already on the train. Just ride it. Ride it. The tracks are visible everywhere. Any place you can enter and get on, because it's the human situation. It's reality itself. You can be a willing and a happy traveler, or not. That's the suffering you cause yourself, or that's the compassion in which you allow yourself to enter, upon which you allow yourself to enter. So in the end, when you say, oh, one seeks suffering, the other flees suffering, well, neither is true. You can say, on the contrary, that both seek solidarity with suffering humanity. And that's how it works. You don't seek it, but you don't flee from it. And you are in solidarity with it, whether you're Jesus or Siddhartha. It's just the way things are. So I said we'd have time for some comments.